Aggelos. In addition to sounding like some off-brand waffle you would find in the freezer aisle, it's also a throwback to the classic Wonder Boy games. And I love Wonder Boy, so the fact that someone sent this to me, that was pretty special. And I had a lot of fun with it, although it is a game that has a few issues. Now before we get into this properly, I am playing this on a Steam Deck like I like to do, and while you can start the game up perfectly fine without any issues I found, it didn't recognize my controller out of the box. And while there is a setting to enable controller support, all that did was recognize my controller had a start button but ignored everything else. In order to actually make this game work properly, I had to go into Steam's controller settings and basically create a faux keyboard to controller layout. It's not complicated and it works well enough, but it shouldn't really be the case. So if you do plan on getting this and you're having some controller issues, you'll probably have to do that, and just be aware of that. Now the story to this game is relatively simple. You're wandering around, suddenly, princess in danger. You gotta go save her by defeating the monsters that are actively attacking her. Being the good hero that you are, you return her home, promptly through the sewers, like you do, and in doing so, you notice this weird splotch thing that definitely won't be your problem in 2.53 minutes. Precisely 2.53 minutes later, it becomes your problem. And it turns out there's a rip in space that leads to an evil dimension. That's kind of a bit like your dimension, but evil. Now you gotta go collect 4 different elements at various temples around the planet so that you can go and traverse this evil dimension and defeat evil. So go do that thing, hero. Story-wise, it's not an overly complicated game. It's a very good versus evil, very clear-cut kind of story, but the nice thing is, as you play through the game, there are moments that actually advance the plot in the background, which does lend a little bit of nuance to it. It's not simply everything in the world is entirely static. No, there's stuff going on in the background as you're doing your own questing, and I appreciate that. It takes a relatively simple plot and at least makes it a little deeper. Overall, the plot isn't anything special, but it's got enough little touches that do make it a lot more engaging than it otherwise could have been, and I appreciate that. Now, the gameplay to Aggelos is that you pop it into your toaster, wait about 3 minutes, and then somehow after that 3 minutes, it's both burnt and frozen at the same time. But as a game, it's very much a throwback to the old school Wonder Boy games. You have characters with big, goofy, expressive faces fighting off against enemies that don't look all that threatening but will absolutely murder you, collecting new equipment as you try and traverse dungeons to get new abilities so that you can advance the plot. Fairly standard stuff, but it's done relatively well. Although there are a couple issues here I have with it. The gameplay kind of has a bit of a formula to it. You start out in the world, having to traverse the entire environment, figure out where you need to go. Early on, your entire movement options are walking in any direction, attacking and jumping, and that's your lot, but as you move through the game, that will expand. You move through the environments, interacting with various town folks, sometimes going and getting new equipment where available, but your whole goal is to get to these various temples. There's usually some extra obstacle in the way that requires you to go and find a new ability that will increase your movement options, thus giving you richer exploration options, which I definitely appreciate. And it does have a bit of a Metroid feel to it, where once you pick up a new movement option, you are pretty much using that throughout the rest of the game pretty consistently. This is a very movement-focused game, and I appreciate that very heavily. Once you get to the dungeons, it's pretty simple. You navigate the maze, you attack enemies. About halfway through the dungeons, you'll pick up a new magic ability. Now, at the start, you don't have any magic, but basically this just enables a new button in conjunction with One Direction to allow you to do something interesting and new. And this too will be some form of movement tech. The first one you get is that you can create platforms in specific areas with a certain magic input, and this completely changes how you traverse different rooms. You'll end up getting air dashes, a teleport, as well as the ability to like super jump underwater, and these will all be used very consistently throughout the game. Now, magic is a little bit weird. It utilizes these little pips on the top of the screen, these little blue gem things, and these are a renewable resource. They're your MP of sorts. While relegating magic to a renewable resource to prevent spamming in combat scenarios makes a lot of sense, the fact that every single magic affects your movement options and are indeed necessary to navigate entire rooms of this game creates a lot of mechanical friction between its concept and its execution. Every time you use the magic, you use one of your MP. In order to get that MP back, you have to attack an enemy once. Now, this works on paper for the combat-specific portion of using magic, because they don't want you to just sit in the corner spamming fireballs completely without threat. Although plenty of enemies later on have projectile attacks that are unbelievably frustrating in certain situations, that prevents that anyway. But while I can respect not wanting to make players complacent in hiding in the corner spamming magic, requiring a renewable resource to something that is affecting your movement and environmental navigational abilities is problematic. You will enter entire rooms that require execution of utilizing very precise magic, and if you run out of MP halfway through, you just have to leave the room, find an enemy to smack a few times, and then just do it again. And that's just a waste of time. The game kind of recognizes this problem as well, as a tacit admission to how utilizing a resource to maneuver through basic rooms is possibly a bad idea. They do slap a obligatory enemy at the start of any room that really requires it, but the thing you have to understand is, when you enter those rooms, it's going to be actively attacking you, so killing it's probably going to be the first thing you do before you even look around the room. So if you're going to be using that specific enemy to recharge yourself if you screw up the room halfway down the line, you're still going to have to remove all your progress, leave the room, and respawn it just to go through it. And it's just a very ineloquent solution to a problem. Look, I get that they're trying to make you more precise in your magic usage and become a lot more masterful with your magic and problem solving skills. I do get that, but requiring players to basically remove all the progress they make on a specific puzzle or a specific execution challenge just because of a renewable resource that's really only there to prevent combat spamming isn't good. And the funny thing is this game kind of has a built-in way around that as well, because there are other movement options you get that aren't given to you through magic. You learn them through combat teachers. They teach you new abilities that allow you to utilize your weapons to destroy blocks or jump a little bit higher, you know? Stuff that basically does the same thing as magic, except it's not magic related, and it won't completely mess up room navigation if you run out of a resource that only exists to prevent combat spam. Honestly, it's one of the few issues I think this game has mechanically, and it's just weird, especially during the later dungeons, which get really, really precise and difficult. Like, they really want you to understand how to use magic. The only other way to really mitigate this is to build up your magic stock by collecting magic increasing power-ups, of which there are 3, doubling how much magic you have. But even then, if you're not super precise or you make an honest mistake and miss something, it's kind of just a mess the way they have this set up when it comes to using your magic for environmental navigation, which is unfortunately the majority of how you use it. Once you get them in the dungeon, like I said, you'll pretty much be spamming this attack until you navigate it up to the boss, at which point you will be pretty much just spamming the magic until you kill the boss, because the bosses seem to be built specifically for the magic de jour. Speaking of bosses, they are pretty awesome visually. They are huge, they, like everything else, got huge expressive eyes, and they look kind of silly and fun, but they are absolutely threatening. However, while most of the bosses are a little bit tricky, they don't really sit on a difficulty curve so much as they're a series of difficulty spikes, and then one giant dip in difficulty later on, and then an even bigger difficulty spike later on. Every single boss is relatively tricky, but it comes to a head, well, both at the end with the final boss who's insanely hard, but also about halfway through the game when you fight this dragon who is really unbelievably tricky. But then the next boss, you can literally just face tank everything and you will be perfectly fine. I'm not sure why they decided one boss should be completely without challenge when the rest were noticeably very difficult, but either way, there's just a boss that is a complete freebie for some reason. I can only assume this is because the dungeon you fight that boss in is bigger and more complicated than the rest of them, and as you go through the game, the dungeons do get bigger and more complex. but it's just weird that there's a boss that is pretty much without any difficulty whatsoever. Once you clear that dungeon, the plot sort of advances in the background, although you probably won't notice until about halfway through the game, at which point the entire navigation of the world becomes a lot more frustrating. It's not fun, but plot happens, and as you get through the game more and more, simply getting through rooms gets a lot more difficult and a lot more frustrating. And you're a huge target, so it's really hard and frustrating just to get through rooms without sitting around clearing everything slowly and meticulously. And maybe that was the point, but even then, you take a lot of damage dealing with that. Now, fortunately, you can work around this, because a lot of the things you get in this game as rewards or power-ups or whatever affect your numbers. You get more health from grabbing heart pickups, you can increase your magic count, you get different armors and swords, and these are great. I appreciate that the swords and armor actually change your sprite. That's fantastic. I love little stuff like that. It goes a long way to making this game a lot more immersive. However, it's not strictly just number increases. Quite a few of the swords and armors actually have a secondary purpose to them, and I really appreciate this. For example, there's a set of armor that will protect you against fire damage, and considering you have to navigate through a volcano at one point, might be a little bit useful to grab that. Just saying. Hint hint, wink wink, nudge nudge, poke poke, prod prod, wear it. So even though your equipment might have statistically higher advantages if you grab something else, there might be a reason not to grab the best stuff, just because other stuff might be better for the environment that you're in. There's also a couple of really neat little things in the background I don't think are necessarily told to you anywhere, but like one of the swords you get is a lightning sword, which is one of the more powerful weapons you get. And if you take it underwater, it'll actually basically create an electric shield around you every time you swing it, which is ridiculous, and I kinda love it. But all sorts of swords get different projectiles and things that make it a lot more interesting to find out what every weapon uses. Getting a new piece of equipment in this game does feel very, very significant because, first of all, you're changing how you look and you're maturing as a warrior, but of course, it's also cool just to experiment and see what your new piece of kit does. There's a few side quests in the game. Well, okay, there's one side quest in the game that is sort of portrayed as several side quests in the game, but it's ultimately to get you the best equipment in the game. I wish there was more side quests that were less interconnected, and the side quest we do get has you going through the same person twice for the exact same reason, like within 2 minutes. It's very, very weird. And the final step of actually like getting the thing so that you can do the thing, look, it's a jar. You get a jar so that you can actually do the quest. And it's weird that you have to go so far out of your way just to get a jar when you can see so many people just have them in the background and you can find them in stores. It's weird that that's one of the final steps of this quest that you're going so far out of your way to do when you could just bother the alchemist to lend you one of his bottles. I don't know. I think part of the reason there isn't as many is because there's really a limit to how many rewards there are, because what can they really reward you with? Money and experience aren't really all that valuable. There's weapons and armor, but you have to buy most of those. They're very limited with what they can reward you with, and I think because of that there aren't that many side quests, but I wish there were more, and that they were a little bit more varied than what we got. Still, there's a little bit more to detour your adventure, and it's worth doing so. Overall, Aggelos as a game is a relatively fun platforming adventure, which you can get lost in this world, and it's fun to test out all these new abilities and see what you get as you grow as a warrior, as well as become more robust in your movement options. It's a fun game movement-wise. Bosses are a little bit frustrating, and enemies later on get just downright really sadistically put in places, but I think the experience is still a lot of fun. The overall presentation to Aggelos is fantastic for what it's going for. It wants to look like Wonder Boy. It looks like Wonder Boy. Giant expressive eyes on everything. Huge sprites for enemies as well as bosses that just look really fun, and it's great to see this stuff. It does make enemies seem very intimidating despite how cute they are, and it's just really cool to see giant enemies. Audio-wise, it sounds like something straight out of the Genesis, so, you know, for what it's going for, it works. Although I don't think there's all that much audibly that's all that memorable, it works for what it needs to do, and it does so well. Overall, the presentation to Aggelos is pretty solid. Now, if you want a copy of Aggelos on Steam, it is available for about $20, although currently it's the Steam Summer Sale and it's available for about $5. And I have to give a huge shout out and thank you to someone who wishes to remain anonymous for sending this to me, because, well, they know I like Wonder Boy, and getting to experience more Wonder Boy, even if it's off-brand Wonder Boy, is always a treat for me. That said, At $20, I do think that's a bit expensive for what this game is. I know it's entirely an arbitrary personal thing, but as someone who doesn't have a lot of money, go support the Patreon to change that, I think $20 is more than I'm comfortable paying for most indie games. I tend to cap it at about $15. And in particular, I think Aggelos would be more comfortable at that $5 range. Maybe 10 if you're really starved for more Wonder Boy, but 20, that's a bit excessive. That said, it's not just on Steam. You can get it on the Switch. You can get it on whatever Xbox console exists nowadays. I think I saw it on the Xbox One many years ago, and I'm sure it's on PlayStation as well. It's a pretty readily available game if you want to play more Wonder Boy. And Wonder Boy's a great series, so getting to be able to play more of that, it's a ton of fun. Overall, Aggelos has its issues. Overly difficult bosses that are kind of nonsensical, really sadistic enemy placement near the end, and a magic requirement that makes environmental navigation frustrating at times. But it's still a really fun, silly, quirky adventure. No, it's not the deepest game ever, but it's a pretty solid little platforming game with slight RPG elements. If you want to experience Wonder Boy, but you don't want to dig out an SMS, I think this is a pretty solid choice. Maybe skip the freezer aisle and try Aggelos the game.